Totally joined. Great. Okay, I can hear something. We've the spinning thing again. See, there needs to be an issue. Otherwise, this is the way this technology piece works. If it all went too swimmingly, sure. We'd be living in that perfect world we're all dreaming of. What are you getting on your end?
Sort of a time delay when you speak, and I can see you, but a gray screen below.
Gray screen. And your camera is trying to work, is it? There's no button to turn on camera or any of that kind of thing visible. So, hi, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We're just
No.
no.
Let
Okay.
me, maybe I'll leave it and try. Let me see if I can request to join.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Try that out. Oh, yeah. Accept.
Oh,
Yeah, I can hear you still, but still nothing with the camera. Well, there's another request. That's somebody else. I wonder, and are you still getting a delay?
yes. Nope. I wonder if I might turn off my phone and then just see if that rejigs anything.
Okay, yeah, you do your
Yep.
thing. Yeah, try it out. Yeah, there's no rush. Yeah, take your time. Caoimhe isn't able to join. So, for those of you that are here and are going to stay here, a little bit of patience. We're just trying to get Caoimhe sorted. For those of you that know of Caoimhe, she has quite a history in terms of activism, human rights initiatives. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to have a conversation with her, as this whole topic of has it started? Yeah. Your request. Accept. Oh, something's happening. How's that working? There's something on the screen. So are you there, Caoimhe? Yeah, so oh, there you are. Is that you? Is that Caoimhe or is that someone else? Who's there on the video? Let's see what's going on here. Invite. Caoimhe. Oh, Caoimhe. So we managed to get somebody else here too. I don't know
I
how this
love it.
works. So whoever that is, I can't really tell. Maybe you would, if you can see your picture on the screen, would you leave and just come back then to listen to the conversation? Unless you've something very important to.
Oh,
Lovely to see you, Caoimhe.
likewise.
Thank you so much for joining. And thank you very much to everyone who is here and being very patient with us as we go through the inevitable issues. Um, so the idea around this is I had a conversation with Vivian. Vivian is one of the co-owners of Sora, and Sora work with indigenous communities who produce cacao. And for the last few years, we've been doing different projects. And the last November and the November before, we did stuff around men's health, men's well-being. So we did the November, and then this year, Vivian asked about the idea of. She just brought the topic of activism up because obviously it's so in our faces at the moment, and there's a real invitation to. I suppose it's a fine line. Like I was listening, I listened to your conversation with Sheila Shoiga, and I listened to Denise as well, Denise Goff, and Denise talking about the idea that she's not interested in trying to convince anybody. She's got enough to be doing, and I resonate with that. And at the same time, I feel like there's so much conditions around activism, and it's been such a marginalized piece, and we in the West, in so many respects have been pretty buffered from so much of the trauma that is going on around the world. We've been in this kind of bubble, and I kind of feel like what's been going on in Palestine has been something that has begun to crack that bubble and has a lot of people beginning to think of things beyond the scope of you know, surviving in terms of their families and work, and that the bigger world is calling them to pay attention. And I've had all kinds of conversations with people around it, and the conversations that have gone along the lines of, that's their business. We're not meant to be. We're not meant to be. We're not meant to be living in a world that's global. We're meant to be doing, all of these different kind of, I suppose, reactions or responses to seeing what we're seeing on our screens on a daily basis and continuing to see. Um, so the idea of the conversations was just to have a conversation about it, just to talk about what it is that inspires people that I feel are participating in a way that is important. And in that they have a voice and an opportunity to speak just to speak and to be heard. And however that conversation lands is how it lands. But the idea that it might offer somebody a resource or an angle or an opinion or an idea that will resonate with them in stepping into what I feel activism really is it's a conversation we're having with life. It's an invitation to participate in a conversation. And again, I feel like in the West, quite often we carry a lot of this "I'm not good enough," this piece that in some way stops us from feeling like our voice matters. And yet, I've heard you say this in other conversations I've seen you have around, and obviously other people say it, how important it is for us to say things, even in the face of feeling like that voice might not be of worth, or it might not have an effect, or it might be too small, or, and often that kind of burnt out before they begin kind of feeling of, you know, there's nothing I can do, and getting stuck in that, as opposed to exploring it or going into it or doing it even in the face of that sense of there's nothing I can do. Um, so initially I had when I asked, I kind of sat with the idea of who would I speak with, and one of the names that kind of came up is Kathy Scott, who's an old friend of mine. And part of the reason her name came up is because over the years I've really seen her develop in terms of her voice, you know, and showing up and speaking very clearly and wisely to a lot of really important pieces that are kind of that are in the zeitgeist, that are kind of happening at the moment. And with Moncon's passing, Kathy just felt like she needed a time to sit back and digest a lot of that. And she offered me your name, and we had this conversation, and now you're here. So maybe would you say a little bit about where you're coming from, just a little bit of your background?
I was thinking geographically, or
Yes, geographically from originally from Ireland, but my parents migrated when I was very young, so I grew up in Canada for early childhood, and then Mauritius and Zimbabwe, and then I lived in New York for a little while, and sort of became involved with social justice, human rights movement, that then translated into spending years in Mexico and Guatemala and Haiti. And then the rest of my adult life, or significant portion of it, in Palestine, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria. So in a way, sort of migration has been, and again, passport privileged, racialized or racial privileged, and by choice migration. But migration has been sort of a theme in my own upbringing, and also in to sort of in a different way in the work of my parents and the communities that they were involved in, and sort of what I was exposed to vis-a-vis understanding of both injustice and also colonial legacies in the context in which we grew up. So in a way, I find it always interesting, and you know, when I hear people speak about, you know, devalidating their voice, or, you know, feeling an imposter syndrome about speaking about justice, and I think part of that is deliberate by the systems in which we live in. There is a deliberate, I think, attempt really to negate, you know, that sense of individual and collective power, to negate the urgency, you know, of a necessary response, and I think in a way, because of the fact that I was raised in so many different cultural, geographic, religious, linguistic contexts, I observed and witnessed perhaps what other people in, as you mentioned, Michael, you know, a Western context of comparative privilege and mobility and all of the things. But I observed that from a much younger age, as do the majority of the world's population. And what's really struck me over the last 2 years, particularly, has been that the majority of the world's population see what is happening in Gaza for what it is. You know, the language of genocide, of infanticide, you know, deliberate and systematic targeting of children, deliberate and systematic targeting of communities, and, you know, all of the conditions necessary for human life, not even going into human life, you know, in terms of meaning, but and choice, but healthcare, education, shelter, food, water and sanitation, you know, sort of facilities. But I think perhaps what is happening on a global level is that sort of what concealed, what masked systems that are predicated on violence,
Mm.
is becoming a lot clearer to people.
Mm.
And in that clarity, just the visceral nature, I think, of what people have been absorbing for 2 years through their telephones, these images of such horrific loss. It is creating a paradigm shift in the world.
Yeah.
And I see that not just on a socio-political level, it's happening really, I feel, on a spiritual level. People are assessing, what does it mean to live an examined life? What does it mean to live any life when we remain silent, in the face of the deliberate, targeting of an attempted erasure of a people and peoples, beyond Gaza, obviously. I think people have become aware, recently of Darfur, of Congo, of all of these interlocking systems, that are, it doesn't take much interrogation to see that, walking down the street, people who are sleeping in the cold, people who live the sharp end of the violence of poverty. Um, and in a way, as you mentioned, and I think many other people have seen over the past 2 years, the invitation of Gaza, of Palestine. Um, and I see a comment by Pals for Palestine has lifted the veil. It has, it is a lens with which to view and understand systemic injustice, and to make a decision, and pre 2 years ago, I used the language of nuance, and it was a word that I used a lot. I don't use it anymore. I really think at this stage, it is so glaringly apparent, that one either stands on the side, of accepting a world in which the whole scale slaughter of children has somehow become permissible, in which military industrial complexes, companies make billions, off of the weaponry that pierces, the vulnerable abdomens and heads of children, or we don't. And in this invitation, I think, of this stepping over into this space of, radical love, and that's what I've seen on the streets for the last 2 years. Radical love. People grieving the children of Gaza and now of Al-Fashar, of Congo, of their neighbors, in a way that this illusory divide between us and them is gone. It's a we. I see that in, people like Miss Rachel, the children's programmer, that that she is being courageous, taking the lead from the courage of so many women in the global south who have gone before her. But it is. I've heard so many terms around this time: awakening, sort of shaking off. But it feels increasingly like a very deeply spiritual shift for people, and a shift into. And it was interesting because, again, I think back to, and I've been involved in and around Palestine for over 25 years, and multiple other contexts in Haiti and Chiapas and Guatemala and all over Ukraine, Southern Africa, etc. But I remember I always had an unease with the word rage. It didn't. I always found it difficult not to find voice around speaking about injustice, but to yell. And I read this reframing of it today, and it was in a context of indigeneity. It was talking about indigenous struggles and how to reframe rage as something beautiful and life protecting, and not to see it as it's, not to always see anger as toxic and corrosive and the antithesis of our movements. And there is both, and there has to be an anger within this. There has to be a no, enough, as well as all of the yeses that we embrace, a yes of life, yes of community, of love, of mutual respect and support. And but it just feels sometimes when we lose all other language for speaking about what these 2 years of horror and the 78 years that preceded them in this specific context of Palestine have been, that it's just such a profound soul entrenched no. And I think people know this at their core. And any attempt, to belittle activism or to, sort of pathologize it, or at this stage, I just think, yes, of course it's messy. Human beings are messy. And traumatized people come into this space of activism. I see that all the time, maybe without having done that inner work, that inner journeying, to be able to stay steady within the storms that can buffet one within it. But messy and all, as they are, they show up. And I see that, I see a lot of sometimes broken, beautiful people who can see the brokenness, of this world, stepping into a place of witness, and finding voice, even when that voice is shaky, but finding it and understanding that we are the majority, the people who see this as it is. The empire has no clothes, who can see this buffoonish character, sort of cartoonish, figures that are making these decisions. And yet buffoonish, people that are making decisions that have horrific consequences on the lives of so many. Sorry, that was a much
No, that was
longer
great. That was
answer
great.
than
That was
planned.
great. Well, look, I'm here to listen to you, so thank you. Like there is a piece, like I think around, like the people I've spoken to who've, would have initially seen, like I remember when I started seeing what was going on, and I really had never paid any attention to, like I lived in Zambia when I was in my early 20s, and I lived on an island in the Zambezi. It was a small group of us, and it was kind of a backpackers. It was just a word of mouth place, and people would arrive by little kayaks. And I remember we had two Israelis living there with us in the community, and they were sweethearts. And one of them had left to avoid military service, and the other one, she'd had military service. And on the island, we had a little CB radio to contact the mainland. And every time the radio went off, she'd have a panic attack. But I really, when the whole thing kicked off 2 years ago, I found myself looking at it, kind of going, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be real. This couldn't make sense. It just didn't make sense to me. And it coincided for me with some very deep shamanic work in terms of kind of tapping into a much deeper capacity for myself to feel a sense of grief that I'd never felt in my own life, that I denied myself. And it was a sense of, as that piece came online for me, my capacity to grieve in a sense that was non-personal opened up. And I found myself really overwhelmed by, like, night after night, I'd sit by the fire and I'd look at these images, and I was just devastated. And there was that walking that fine line of knowing I had come out of a place in which my mechanism to survive in the world had been to protect my heart, to cut it off, to draw a line. Like I remember when I lived in Zambia years and years ago, and I was working on an AIDS project, and I was working in the city, and I had this little house with walls around it, and when I went in, I was safe, and I looked at everything was okay, and then you'd go out and it would just be chaos. And I remember going out one morning, and there was a dump outside the wall of the house I lived in, and there was a dead body in there. And very soon after that, I went to an afternoon. It was a kind of an expat afternoon, and the Archbishop of the Diocese of Lusaka was there. And Lusaka is bigger than Ireland. And I remember I spent about 4 hours having this conversation with him. Is like, how do you do this? How do you live in this world with all of this going on and keep going? How do you? And I remember leaving none the wiser. And on some level, unconsciously, I decided, well, there's nothing I can do about that, so I'm just going to not go there. And I think for me, for the next, 40 years, 30 years, that was kind of how I survived, until I reached a point at which I needed to unlock that peace within myself. And knowing then, as I began to watch what was happening in Palestine, that I was unwilling to just close off to it. That was just no longer an acceptable means by which I could keep going. So I had to find this way of, how do I allow myself to metabolize, to stay open, like, can I find a way in which my nervous system can stay open to this? Does it mean I need to go and spend time in nature? Does it need I need to stop looking at it for amounts of time so that I can come back and be of service in whatever way that I can, be it as small as it is? And I think, that's a huge piece in what appears to be in the West a lot of apathy. Uh, I feel like there's so many people I know who aren't willing to look at it because it's too painful to look at. And for me, I kind of feel like, and you spoke into this, the idea that we've grown up in an environment in the West in which there has been an orchestration around the breaking down of community, external community, in the sense of, we are in a group of people and we need each other to survive. We rely on each other. I think there's something fundamentally human about that idea, and that we've gone through this period of the last couple of 100 years, or 100 years anyway, in which we've had an opportunity to explore, well, what's life like without community? What's life like on my own? That I can make money and I can buy this off them and that off them, and I don't need other people. And I think what we're beginning, to see, is the folly in that community is an essential part. Like, I run retreats for men, and the core piece around it is coming back into community after we've lived in this, particularly men, with this idea of, I go alone, I do it alone, I carry it on my own shoulders, it's up to me. All of these deeply ingrained ideas that are a complete lie. And they have men's suicide rates, and men's struggle. And when men begin to experience what community is actually about, how we're designed to resource each other and support each other and be there for each other and witness each other and acknowledge each other and be seen and see how these are an intrinsic part of what it is to live a healthy life, to live a fuller life. And then, for me, that includes the whole world. I feel like we carry within the capacity of our heart, as it opens, this ability to love impersonally. And I don't mean that in the sense of it's not deeply personal, but in a sense of, it's bigger than us. There's something bigger than us moving through us that is completely inclusive. There is no exclusion in it. And, and we briefly spoke about that comment you made around James Baldwin and his comment around the idea that every child is our child. And I deeply, and as a parent in particular, I deeply resonate with that. In fact, as you were speaking about it, when I was listening to you speaking with Sheila, like, it's a deeply moving piece to really sit with that and to let that kind of break your heart open. And maybe that's what is happening at the moment in terms of transformation, in terms of growth, in terms of how what we're seeing in the world as affecting some deep change in us is that we need to let it break our hearts open. We need to let our hearts be broken. And those calluses that we've created, that have been enforced or supported by, by that individualism and the comfort that we've acquired over the last, all of those modern comforts, that in some way they've separated from ourselves, from our deeper shared humanity. And maybe that's the piece of reawakening. Like, even in the election in New York, the election here for the presidency, you see people who are really have a social conscience, who speak to something shared, and waking up to that piece.
Yes. Which I think, to loop it back, and it's not to, present things in dichotomies, but the majority of the world has always known this. It's a very small percentage of this planet that has, had the privilege to be able to build these systems, of individualism that atomizes and separates us from that collective sort of beating heart of the whole. And again, it's not to fetishize in any way, the structural inequality, the poverty, that makes that interdependency, that understanding, of the we, as strong as it is in so many parts of the world. But it's not just necessity of survival, it's also cultures of very deeply, societally ingrained care. And I think those exist in Ireland and it's not to exceptionalize Ireland, in the sense that there is, a nascent right. There are, there's a huge, I think, work to be done collectively, societally, to push back against narratives and practices of racism that, exist in an island that has known colonialism, that has known racism and forced migration and famine, and yet are replicating, even in its nascent form. It is a violence, physical, psychological, spiritual, emotional, upon so many communities that I know and work with and draw wisdom from, of people who have survived extremely difficult journeys to make their way here, or migration by choice, in search of something else. But I think to draw this back to Gaza, which is where we began, I think it's not just the horror that has drawn people into this place of witness, through their phones of these broken, massacred bodies of children, of James Baldwin and so many others call, to love them as we love our own children. But it's also, I think, all of those daily demonstrations of what care means societally. And it's so ingrained in Arabic. I was chatting with my son the other day because he was asking me the meanings of some of what I was saying, because we were in Morocco for a post-flotilla event, and I was speaking Arabic, and he heard me, and I was saying, well, this means, may God bless the labor of your hands. And it's said so casually, people walking down the street to, somebody working, somebody repairing a road, somebody who is making the food, alhamdulillah salamtik, like there's so many phrases of love and of care linguistically, and practices of care. And I think as much as people have been, devastated by these scenes of horror, they have been also deeply moved and challenged to think about societies operating in a different way when they see the courage of first responders, of paramedics, who literally risk their lives, every time. Over 260, healthcare workers, more actually, that's journalists, but the amount, or the depth, I think, of societal care that exists in itself has been an education for people. What does the psycho-spiritual mean? Samah Jabir, who is an amazing Palestinian psychologist and community worker, speaks about sabr and samud as endurance. And what does that mean when that samud is so deeply rooted and ingrained within a people's within a refusal to leave their land, a refusal to leave, a culture, a tradition, a society, that has been painstakingly built within occupation, within ethnic cleansing, within 17 years pre this genocide of Hermetic Siege. And I think, to loop back to the interfaith, experience, I think, of this witness, this is also calling on people, for better, for worse, within, all of the spiritual and religious traditions, and not, created, that people exist within, to re-find, those calls for social justice, within their own spiritual fabric. I think of so many Jewish friends over the past 2 years who have, with courage and commitment and dedication, sought to reclaim Judaism for from this warped interpretation and weaponization of Jewish trauma, post the Holocaust. And they are doing it, in a way that is beautiful. I think of rabbinical students, singing in Hebrew and Yiddish as they occupied Central Station at the beginning of the genocide. People refusing for this to be done in their name. And people from so many walks of life that I've spoken to, they keep on looping back to, the inexhaustible care, in the lighthouses of humanity that Gazan hospitals, Palestinian hospitals in Gaza have become, the ambulances, the sacred, tender care, with which you see people cradling the bodies of strangers as if they were their mother or their brother or their sister or their child, because in that moment they are. And I think there is this call in us witnessing, that pain by the fireside or in the forest or in the urban space or wherever we're absorbing it and trying to hold it, to recognize, that one of the calls of this unveiling or, this paradigm shift going on is to practice that care in the immediacy of our families, our communities, our societies, and recognizing that as well as the no's that we are opposing and rejecting, that the yes that we have to lean into is with love and rage and courage and commitment, when it's necessary, burning down these systems, metaphorically, practically, and by that I mean, the brave young people who are occupying, arms manufacturers who are putting their bodies in between, these merchants of death, and I know that can sound like archaic language, but I cannot think of any more apt description at this stage, for CEOs of companies, in these boardrooms that are making these decisions that has that immediately translates or that eventually translates into the flechette shells that are going to kill somebody else's child, and they go home to their children at night, no doubt. And the fact that this dissonance, the dissonance of the Holocaust perpetuators, of that also went home to their children at night. And there is something, in this moment that we're all being called to witness and to be active about that is creating, I think, again, this lens, of seeing, but also this profound courage. And I see this in the millions of people, who are taking to the streets, every week, over and over and over. The octogenarians, with their PAL action signs getting arrested, in London. People who have a lot more to lose than us, taking the risks that they did on the flotilla. I think of all of the people who were with us who were not protected by white privilege and passport privilege and embassies that would probably bail them out, of Israeli detention, and still kept on sailing. And there's so much of that going on in the world at the moment. I think of this kufiya that I have around my neck, and having been involved again for 25 years, I reached a stage pre the genocide where it almost felt tokenistic, and I stopped wearing kufiyas or pins or, because I felt this is a politic that is in heart and soul, and I don't need to prove this to anybody. And it also felt a bit faddish at times. And then I just thought, no, this means something. Every symbol on these kufiyas actually means something, in the Palestinian imaginary and in our imaginary. And I feel it's become a subtle sign. I feel like hugging everybody that I walk by, in an airport who's wearing a kufi or a t-shirt or a pin, because that is a statement, in a global context that is seeking to criminalize solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for freedom. It is a statement, and not something that is trite in countries and contexts in which ICE is operative, or countries or contexts in which people are being criminalized or blacklisted or smeared or dismissed from their academic positions or dismissed, from their survival precarity jobs for this outward expression, not just of solidarity with Palestine, but I think of a lens of seeing far beyond this struggle into a world again, where the satellite imagery from Al Fashir, was visible, and yet, these, in this case, the UIE, fuels and funds and abets another genocide, of people in Darfur. And I just feel at this stage, and it's not that it is ever too late for anybody to step into this space. There is welcome and warmth and embrace of people who step into this space of organizing. But I feel the urgency of this is paramount, because the more we lose space and power, and I'm not talking about, we have so much collective power, but electorally, to the right, the more these discourses become normalized, the more these buffoonish caricatures, of almost cartoonesque villains, can put on a suit and be given a microphone and electoral power to enact policies. I just think of the ICE, raids themselves that fracture families, fracture communities, and the arrogance of that. The harder it is going to become for those who follow us, to push back against this. And I just feel we have a duty to the kids, not just our small humans, but to the teenagers, to the young people who have striked and occupied their campuses and walked out of their high schools. And they see this with a clarity. There's no talk of, I just think, complexity. They see it for what it is. And increasingly, and then I'm going to stop talking, but increasingly, I think this whole societal construct that we somehow evolve and mature as we get older, the truth, that I hear from the mouths of children on demonstrations, it's I don't cry so much anymore at images of horror, because I've witnessed it up close. I've worked in Gaza. I've carried the broken bodies of children. And those memories are indelibly, seared in my mind and soul and spirit. And they're things that I'll never forget. But it's not having become immune to it, but I can absorb a lot of pain and a lot of traumatic imagery without, feeling undone. But what does undo me actually is when I see these vox pops on demonstrations of these small children in demonstrations all over the world, saying this, seeing this for what it is, and asking questions that are sort of framed as, simple and innocent, but are so deep. It's a why? Why are adults allowing this to happen to children? And this, I feel, is, aside from a broader, decolonizing of this world and the systems, that still exist in this world, I really feel this is the calling of our times. It is our moral and sacred duty as adults to stop this. And yeah.
While you say that, I was thinking about the first thing I wanted to say to you as I was driving along this morning, listening to your previous podcast. And the first thing I wanted to say to you is thank you from the bottom of my heart. And I know the bottom of so many hearts for what you have dedicated your life to, that it's just, there are no words. It is beyond words and beyond measure. And thank you so much.
It's a privilege. It really is. I can't think of living life in any other way. But thank you. And I'm getting better at
Thank
saying
God you
thank you
can.
instead of
Thank God. Yeah, well, look, yeah.
there is beauty in it. There's a duality, by the way. There's lots of trauma, but also a lot of beauty. A lot of beauty.
Yeah. Well, and I suppose, like, when you name something like trauma, it's like one of the things I think we've gotten really good at, particularly in the West, particularly in the modern culture we live in, is avoiding like I think of Ireland, and who of us in Ireland doesn't have an alcoholic history in our families? And we've gotten very good at being, at functioning and not addressing our trauma and not addressing and this is one of the reason I do what I do is one, because I've decided that I need to lean into my own trauma, my own wounding as I meet it, and facilitate in whatever way I can a world in which that work gets done and these chains get broken. And you're right in terms of like my feeling is the at least in my life and my line and my ancestral work is that the book stops here. That I will do my damnedest to bring whatever level of healing I can into the world. And I think that for me feels like the richest possible endeavor I can participate in. And also, and you named this too, like when I was sitting there at the beginning of the whole Palestine thing, looking at it and really being able to feel a level of grief I'd never felt in my body before, and learning how to hold that. What I really took huge amount of solace in was the other people who I knew were doing the same thing. And this is where I saw, this medium and social media as an incredible resource, that I was able to get in touch with people who really had love as a living piece in their lives, not just an idea, not just saved for, you know, mass on Sundays or whatever, but it was like let's live this thing and actually bring it into the world and see what it can do in the world. And like you talked about that idea of duality, that if you're willing to face what's actually happening, like one of the pieces for me is this idea of I want to live in a better world, and I also need to face, the way the world is, and that I might not get to that better world, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to continue, striving for that. That it's not about the goal per se, as much as it is about keeping going in the face of what often feels overwhelming or often feels. Um, what came to me as you were speaking, particularly about the children, is I have a 5-year-old, and his favorite story at the moment is The Emperor's New Clothes. And that story is a perfect example of the world we live in, and all of the adults. Nobody's saying anything because they didn't want to lose their permission or their position or be seen as unwise. And it took one little kid in the crowd to go, "He's not wearing any clothes," and suddenly everybody joins in.
Mm.
You, you
And
know, sorry, go on.
mm. No, I was just going to say, I was thinking of that word overwhelm, because there is overwhelm in this. And there's also a very deliberate attempt just to throw everything at us to make us feel overwhelmed by the potential of, and I really see this as Trump and co.'s modus operandi in the States, just overwhelm, confuse, daze, just
Mm,
oppression after oppression and fracture and creating these totally disorientating storms within all of the repressive measures, that are being more visibly actualized in a country in which they long existed. Um, but I think also of, that not being aloneness in it. And I was just distracted by a moment by thinking about the global presence on this lovely small little community of people who have joined tonight. Amongst them, Carowinds from Haiti, and Noah, who was on the last flotilla on the Conscience, and our Pals for Palestine comrades, and amazing Rupa, has moved to Ireland to actualize a really beautiful project and vision, and this interweave of all of these people who, in a way are a microcosm of the millions of people who see this.
mm,
Um, and that's what I've seen, over the past 2 years. I've been on WhatsApp groups, for instance, I'm thinking like Mothers Against Genocide and Pals for Palestine, whom in the beginning of this, some would have been involved, prior to the last 2 years for sure, and
mm,
others stepped into this space, during the genocide. And there were so many comments at the beginning. I remember in those WhatsApp groups of, I'm not sure if I quite know enough. And, I don't really feel confident enough to, speak publicly, but I want to come. I want to be part. Tell me what to do. And I've seen the confidence of those groups grow. Healthcare workers for Palestine, people from so many different walks of life who understand that we don't need to know everything. They don't need to know everything. They don't need to know every single detail of a long history, but what they do need to know is that this is wrong, that it is horrifically wrong. And it's been really interesting to see what began as maybe a more humanitarian narrative shift to a decolonial one, of people understanding indigeneity. And I think in an Irish context, what I've certainly felt in so many of the conversations that I've had, we recently in Irish Artists for Palestine hosted this beautiful, amazing choir from Jerusalem called Banat al-Quds, which means the Daughters of Jerusalem. And they sang these songs of beauty and resistance and joy, up and down this island while they were here. And so much of when they were, particularly in Belfast, their questions were they saw the commonalities. They saw them on the Falls Road, they saw them in the murals, they saw them in the conversations that they had, with ex-political prisoners. And there is an intuitive seeing, I think, of each other that I've really witnessed in Ireland and in Palestine, vice versa. I remember when I went there at the beginning of the second Intifada, which, has become a demonized and criminalized world, but literally means, a shaking off, an uprising. And I remember at the time as a 20-year-old, when I'd say that I was Irish, people's reference point was always Bobby Sands. And it was because they read, the limited books that they could access at that time, now none, but in prison. And, and so many Palestinians talked about, prisons being the university, of whole generations of Palestinian youth, and the horrific conditions, that escalation of horror that exists within detention now, within imprisonment now. But in that duality of the trauma and the joy, and I use that word intentionally because I was speaking to a Palestinian friend the other day in Lisbon, diaspora, Jima, and she spoke about having attended a retreat recently for Palestinian diaspora activists because the heaviness of what they have carried in the past 2 years is devastating. That as many of them talk about, the disassociative grief, the neither being here nor there, that living in this sort of liminal space of being so distracted from, their every day, and yet not being able to be in a place of homeland, to be able to stand and be and absorb some of the suffering of their people. How that has impacted on food, on eating and nutrition, when people know that their people are being starved, deliberately starved, and the really fractured relationship. I know of so many Palestinian diaspora people now who speak about the shame, the guilt that they feel when they eat, and food is such a central part of Palestinian culture and hospitality and oral history. And but also Dima spoke about sacred joy, and I think that there is something, that we need to, within our movements, which can be very serious, and they need to be serious now vis-a-vis Gaza, without a doubt, Sudan, everywhere. The stakes are so high. But sometimes in the left, there is a tendency for us not to also talk about intentional joy, and music and food and nurture and, creating the conditions of beauty that we want everybody to be able to access in this profoundly, violently unequal world. But there is also joy, there is a freedom and a release, I think, for a lot of people who have stepped into this space of understanding, A, that they are far from alone, that they are the global majority who see this for what it is. And B, in systems that dull and intoxify and, are anesthetize us, sometimes societally, to the pain and the suffering and the oppression of others, that there is a profound collective relief, I think, when people engage in their own internal intifada of shaking that off, of stepping into a place of witness, of courage, and of realness, on a burning planet. And it's I always feel this when I come back from things like, and the joy and resistance itself. I just saw a comment from my beautiful comrade Noah. There is so much distraction. I thought of that post the flotilla of coming back through airports, where you're just barraged with advertisements, for products that anesthetize, that keep us on this repetitive circle of earning capital to spend capital, to enrich systems that inevitably are linked to the military industrial complex, that translate into weaponry that kill children at its base, or extractivism, or systems that keep people in rental precarity and, hidden homelessness and, all of the things, healthcare, apartheids that exist, vis-a-vis access. There is so much that we know intuitively when we step outside of it that is not working. And it feels like Palestine, Gaza particularly, but Palestine more generally has become this lens where people begin to, put those interlinking pieces together of why do people in an Irish context. And yes, we can look at colonialism and famine and everything that has led to the self-medication, that alcohol oftentimes served the trauma, and there's also distraction, I think, inherent in it, from feeling, from seeing. But and I'm going off on tangents.
Well, I
But
was gonna. Sorry, go
there
on.
is so much hope, and I would just say, there is so much hope. And if anything, and I frequently get asked by people, how do you hold so much hope? And first of all, I have the very good fortune of maybe because I saw a version of this from a much younger age. I remember seminal moments. Most people do in their childhoods, but they don't always have the opportunity to grow into, that place of witness and consistency. But I have seminal light bulb moments that I remember at, age 9, age 7 of just seeing, the inequality, and that becoming more sophisticated in time vis-a-vis structural analysis, but, just seeing right and wrong as children do. But also a pretty deep wellspring of sacred joy. And I also feel like for any of us to be sustainable within this, with this level of grief, and diffuse trauma or moral injury, whatever we call it, because this injures the spirit and the soul when you're around it for long enough. But it also is solace, for the spirit and the soul, because you enter into community with profoundly beautiful people. And I can't think of anything else that is worth living for as much, as well as nature and ecosystems and all the things from which we can also derive common solace, but to be in communion, with people who, hold those candles within the storms, who are those lighthouses, to ourselves, to each other, but that keep us clear and keep us focused on what we need to be clear and focused on in our lives, as well as love, but love with responsibility. And love in practice is justice, as Cornel West and many others say. But yeah.
What would your advice be to people who are in that place of confusion or overwhelm, or that sense of being, being affected by the barrage of what is just creating conflict? Like, what would your advice be to people?
Do something. It is medicine. And I don't mean just do something to distract us from the dystopic hellscape of a lot of the world, but do something because we have to. And do something because in the doing there is a power, and in the doing you enter into community, and there is a collective caring, or carrying of that in it. But I think in a way we don't have the luxury of overwhelm, and it's not in any way. I mean, I work in mental health in my other iteration. Sometimes I'm a trained psychotherapist, so it's not to negate, obviously, the struggles that so many face in this art of living. There's pain, and there's atomization, but it is to say that I think a lot of, the mental health crises that we see in some quarters are really because of this fracturedness from each other. And and from nature and the land, but also from what we know to be true. And it feels like there's this dual awareness going on. People know, that the distractions, the televisions, the barrage of celebrity news, the projections and the archetypes of heroism and humanity that we, not we, but, that society tries to put on the shoulders of fallible, oftentimes deeply contradictory, sometimes narcissistic beings, which celebrity oftentimes engenders, unfortunately, and I see that in activism too. It is so easy to internalize the constructs of heroism that exist around activism, and which is all the more reason why we need less prominent figures and more collective, carrying of messages. But I think people know that, and we perhaps pivot internally between this awareness that this isn't enough. It's not nurturing. It's not healthy. It's not life-giving. And yet, this systems keep on churning it out to consume and consume and consume. And I think there's a real poetic justice in a younger generation, beginning to, and I think of beautiful Rupa Maria, who's on this call, who I mentioned a few paragraphs ago, a few minutes ago, but of just putting down the phones. And she was saying it in relation to children and a racist Islamophobic attack that took place a few days ago in an Irish school. And she was talking about the right, and that in the absence of, and I'm thinking back to your men's camps here, but in the absence oftentimes of identity, community, all of these things, that the right fills that vacuum, and it's so toxic. But to put down, I think one lens and to pick up another is to be able to step into a place both of profound pain, because of course, but also of profound potential for collective joy and meaning. Because there is, I really think, no other, I mean, maybe aside from the birth of, one's kids and lots of beautiful things like that, but I can't think of anything more powerful and meaningful and beautiful than witnessing the collective freedom of oppressed peoples, within our lifetimes, inshallah, hopefully. But at the very least, we need to do something. And I think that's the call. That is what breaks that intentionally imposed suffocating sense of powerlessness. It's deliberate. It's deliberate because, we're continually told through the media, that activism doesn't make an impact. It does. We've seen that. We've seen that so powerfully over the last 2 years. It does. That we've seen that historically, systems that people thought were omnipresent and forever apartheid, the civil rights movement, many, many other struggles have translated when people take risk. And that doesn't have to be, life endangering. Not everybody needs to jump on a boat or go to the West Bank, and try and stand between sociopathically violent settlers and, olive harvesters. But we can do it in our everyday decisions and everyday conversations, because education is key within this. Not just factual education, emotional literacy around bravery, that people can understand that they can do it too. And that there is power in the collective.
Thank you so much.
Not at all. Oh.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything else you'd like to say before we? I think you've said a lot of amazing stuff, and it's thank you so much. I'm very grateful.
I see Yipeng. I'm thinking healthcare workers and their beautiful, brave witness of do no harm. And on the contrary, instead of doing no harm, they do so much healing in their witness. And I also think of, the flotillas to come. And I would just say, for those who tuned into those recently, to the Samud and the Handala and the Madlin, our movement is very much comprised of sea and land, and we need people on land as much as all of our sailors and people at sea. And it is the only real way into Gaza at this stage, with hermetic closures of borders, opening up that sea, people's humanitarian route. and it can be done, but we need more boats and more people doing it. So either at sea or on land, there's so much to be done.
And if anybody's wants more information, wants to find out more, wants to get in touch, like where do they go?
I'd say that the magic of Google, so much information out there, but
Okay.
vis-a-vis our movements, I'd say follow Freedom Flotilla Coalition, Global Sumud Flotilla, maybe on social media, Healthcare Workers for Palestine, Irish Healthcare Workers for Palestine, and then Ben can probably put links in there for the Canadian iteration of that network, Global Ones. Pals for Palestine is a beautiful group, and it's really a space whereby if you've never been on a demonstration before and want community and friendship and real sisterhood and brotherhood, there's an invitation, just to be part of their blocks, which are always full of children, their intergenerational music, joy, Mothers Against Genocide. There's so many groups doing great things. And I think the first thing really is just to lean into your power and your courage, and whether that's at the fireside or in the forest or with putting one's child to bed, but it is to, in a way, step into what is it's a pretty sacred call, and that is to defend life, and
Beautiful.
yeah, it's time.
Yeah. Thank you, Caoimhe.
Lovely to feel everybody virtually, and Kerowin's in Haiti or the DR. Yeah. Bonsoir, mon ami. Or actually, it's probably a different time zone there, but yeah, big hugs to you all.
Great. Thank you so much. And we're coming back next week. Mary Kennedy is going to have a chat with us next week. You probably know Mary.
Brilliant.
So,
The Manoa.
thank you so much, Caoimhe. Take care of yourself.
Pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Definitely.
Bye.
Good night.